So moving on to wetlands. Wetlands are very important biomes, and they are a transitional zone between an aquatic ecosystem, freshwater, and a terrestrial one. So it's a boundary between the two. So they obviously are wet, and they support an abundant amount of plant and aquatic life and bird, waterfowl, and other organisms. So because the water tends to be very shallow in wetlands, the entire aquatic habitat here is a photic zone. So lots of photosynthesis, lots of production by plants, aquatic plants, but also phytoplankton, algae. So an abundant amount of resources for organisms to take care of, to feed organisms, to take care of organisms. So a lot of organisms in the benthic area, in the mudflats. There's clams, there's worms, there's amphibians, small, medium-sized fish, and that feeds all of these birds that come in to feed. And of course, then there's predatory birds. So it's an abundant and diverse habitat, or biome, actually, with a huge variety, good diversity of organisms. Let's move on to the ocean environment, marine biomes. So they are very diverse, in particular because they're huge and they have a large variation in depth. So they range from the real vivid corals in the shallower waters, warmer waters, to the perpetually dark regions in the deepest oceans. So the benthic realm is the seafloor, whether it's the shallow seafloor near the shore or somewhere deeper. But if it's the bottom of the ocean, the seafloor, that's the benthic realm. And there's many organisms that live there on the benthic realm based on depth. Now the pelagic realm refers to all the open ocean spaces, and of course that is filled by numerous types of fish and mammals like whales, and of course the floating phytoplankton, which are photoautotrophic, right? They're photosynthesizers, producers, and then the small floating zooplankton, often juvenile things like juvenile fish, juvenile crustaceans, lobsters, crabs, those sorts of things. And they feed on the phytoplankton. So that's the base, the beginning, first steps of the food chain in the aquatic realm or in the pelagic realm. So in shallow areas, it's the photic zone, and that includes the open pelagic regions and the shallow inshore regions. So it can be out in the middle of the ocean, but if it's the shallow area where photosynthesis can occur, that's the photic zone. And that can go down to up to 200 meters, even though most of the photosynthesis is in the shallower waters. Photosynthesis by the phytoplankton and multicellular algae like kelp provides the energy for a diverse community of animals. So again, the photosynthetic organisms, whether they're algae or phytoplankton, capture sunlight energy, so those are the producers in the aquatic realm. So the pelagic zone has zooplankton, fishes, and marine mammals of different sorts that tend to inhabit different regions or different depths. And some, of course, can surface and dive deep, depending on the organisms. In the shallower, warmer zones, in tropical waters, we have coral reef systems, coral reef biomes. And they are very important. They're very diverse. They're kind of like the tropical rainforests of the sea. Habitat for numerous types of fish and organisms, corals, sponges, worms, crustaceans, crabs, lobsters, all kinds of stuff. The photic zone does extend down to about 200 meters, just over 600 feet, 650 feet. But again, most of it's in the shallower water, but light does penetrate that deep. Beyond that, 200 to 1,000 meters. That's referred to as the twilight zone, the aphotic zone, dominated by a variety of small, medium, large fishes and invertebrates, things without backbones, like octopuses. And then below that, below 1,000 feet, it is completely and perpetually dark. No photosynthesis at all is possible here. And unique types of fish live down here, some that can bioluminesce and produce light. And of course, in the benthic realm, different organisms that can survive down here. And many of them rely on organic material that falls down the water column. All these organisms higher in the water column eventually die, drift down, decompose, and provide nutrients for some of these deeper sea organisms. And that's a source of nutrients for them because no photosynthesis is possible down here. And down in the aphotic zone, deep waters, is where we find those hydrothermal vents that we talked about when we were talking about the evolution of life on Earth. Where's my cursor? Here we go. Okay, so there's a boundary between land and the ocean, and that's the intertidal zone. And the intertidal zone is much more interesting when it's the rocky intertidal zone. If it's a nice, smooth, sandy beach, it's still a transition zone between land and ocean, except there's not very much habitat in just pure sand, so that's why you don't see many things living or growing there. But in the rocky intertidal zone, there's a lot of habitat there that certain organisms have adapted to, and they're specialized for these types of environments, and we find them nowhere else on Earth. One reason why is because the shore is pounded by waves, it's flooded at high tide, nice cold water, and at low tide, these organisms are exposed to warmer environments, dry air, they can desiccate, and baking sun during the summer. So these organisms that are in the intertidal zone, especially the rocky intertidal zone, are extremely well adapted and have evolved to this particular really harsh environment. Okay, estuaries. These are transition areas between a river and the stream and the open ocean. So they're kind of like, they're a type of wetland, but they're a wetland where fresh water comes into contact with salt water, ocean water. So the salinity then will range from close to fresh water. In other words, if there's a nice large river going right into the ocean, and the river kind of fans out a bit to form an estuary, most of that water is going to be somewhat fresh. However, with tides flowing in and flowing out, there is a mix of water. So sometimes the water in the estuary can be as salty as the ocean water. And sometimes it can be saltier if, let's say, a high tide comes in and there's water that mixes with the fresh water in an estuary. Then when the low tide moves out, you might get trapped pockets of water. Imagine kind of like a pond type of situation. And with evaporation, that water actually can become saltier than the ocean water. So it's a challenging place to live, but it's an abundantly diverse place because, again, just like with wetlands, this water is nice and shallow, and it's usually warmer than the open ocean because it's shallow and can get warmed by sunlight. So it's very productive due to all of this area being a photic zone, photosynthesis, right? Feeding aquatic plants, algae, those are the producers, food for things like worms and clams, crustaceans, crabs, crayfish, lobsters, and then aquatic fish, well, obviously, but juvenile fish, whether they're from the ocean or even fresh water, mostly ocean, and then those resources provide abundant food for all of the birds, all the waterfowl. So these are some of the most productive areas on Earth, just like wetlands are. They are threatened, however, by human activities, things like landfills that fill up estuaries, and of course wetlands. Nutrient pollution. Waters water flow. Rivers carry in sediment, but also agricultural runoff. Excess nitrogen and phosphorus can cause nutrient pollution, choking open water areas, reducing oxygen content, and even creating what are called dead zones. Pollution. Back in 2010, there was the Deepwater Horizon open ocean spill in this Gulf of Mexico, and just thousands and thousands and thousands of gallons of crude oil spilled and created a nasty toxic area through a huge swath of the northern Gulf of Mexico. And they're still recovering from the full effects of this. So humans, unfortunately, have a large capacity to cause problems in terms of environmental problems. Okay, let's look at how climate affects the terrestrial, Earth's biome distribution on planet Earth. So, the terrestrial biomes are distributed on planet Earth based on climate. So climate, in terms of especially temperature and rainfall, are the main factors that determine what type of biomes are found on Earth and where they're found on Earth. So temperature and rainfall is very, very important. So the Earth's global climate patterns result from the solar energy radiation striking the Earth, warming the surface of the Earth. That creates currents, wind currents, that creates clouds, that creates movements of warm and cold air, rainfall, precipitation, and then the Earth is also spinning, so that contributes to wind and even currents and even tides. So on the planet's surface, all of these factors determine, and especially temperature and rainfall or precipitation, where these biomes are found on planet Earth. So the equator, at 0 latitude, around the middle of the Earth, the equator receives the greatest amount of consistent solar radiation. So it tends to be nice and warm. Because of that, warm air evaporates water. Warm, moist air rises. When it reaches altitude, it cools. The water condenses and falls down locally as rainfall. So the equator tends to be nice and warm and abundant rainfall there. As the air rises, drops its water, moisture, it moves away from the equator. It's dry air. And as it drops, it creates kind of a current, air currents of cold air moving away, especially dry air, moving away from the equator, and that dry air absorbs moisture and creates a dry zone at about 30 degrees north and south of the equator. And no coincidence, those 30 degrees north of the equator, near what's called the Tropic of Cancer, or south of the equator, near the Tropic of Capricorn, we find many of the Earth's deserts. So the main reason tropical rainforests are found near the tropics is because of this pattern of local abundant rainfall caused by solar radiation at the equator near the tropics. Tropic of Cancer, Tropic of Capricorn. So temperate zones, they have milder climates than the tropics or the polar regions, north and south polar areas. And that's because they're further away from the equator, but not so far away that they're going to be very cold. And these tropical zones, like California's in a tropical zone, temperate zones. California and like the Mediterranean are in these temperate zones, north of the Tropic of Cancer, and there's also some south of the Tropic of Capricorn. So tend to be mild winters, mild summers on average. And again, these are generalizations. There's always exceptions, especially where there's mountains. And talking about mountains. So climate is also affected by proximity to large bodies of water, like close to the oceans, and the presence of landforms, especially mountain ranges, which can change drastically local climatic and then biome conditions. So mountains affect climate in two major ways. First, warm air